The scream didn't come from far away. That was the first thing Daniel realized. It came from inside the woods, close enough that the sound bent around the trees and slipped through the cracks of his cabin windows like cold air. Not loud, not panicked, just long, thin, as if someone had started screaming and then forgotten how to stop. Daniel stood frozen at the sink, his hands still submerged in water that had gone numbingly cold. The scream cut off mid-breath. Silence followed, thick, heavy, the kind that presses against the ears. Outside, the winter forest stood motionless beneath moonlight. Pines bowed under the weight of snow. Shadows stretched unnaturally long between trunks, as if the darkness had learned to lean. No wind. No animals. No distant road noise. Just the woods waiting. Daniel wiped his hands on his jeans and moved toward the window. That's when he saw the footprints. They began at the edge of the tree line, pressed deep into the fresh snow. Bare feet. Too long. Too narrow. The toes dragged uneven, as if whoever made them hadn't fully remembered how feet worked. The prints stopped 10 feet from his porch. They didn't turn back. They didn't continue forward. They just ended. Daniel's phone buzzed in his pocket, making him flinch. Unknown number, don't answer it. Before he could react, the porch light flicked on by itself, and something knocked, slowly, on the cabin door. By the 7th night, Daniel Harper stopped pretending the cabin was just a building. It watched him. Not in the way eyes watch, but in the way a room knows when you've entered it. The way silence tightens when it becomes aware of being disturbed. The cabin creaked differently now, as if responding to his movements. Floorboards sighed under his weight like tired lungs. Walls ticked softly, counting something he couldn't see. The woods pressed close behind the house. Too close. During the day, they seemed ordinary enough. Snow-heavy pines, gray bark, frozen earth. But even sunlight couldn't push all the darkness away. The shadows between the trees stayed thick, pooled like ink. Daniel found himself avoiding the back windows. Every time he looked, he felt the urge to look again. And again. As if something might shift when he wasn't watching. His uncle's belongings were still here. That unsettled him more than he expected. Old coats hung by the door, pockets still weighted with keys that opened nothing. Boots sat neatly by the wall, caked with dried mud that didn't match the soil around the cabin. In the bedroom closet, Daniel found a cardboard box sealed with duct tape. Inside were notebooks. Dozens of them, each filled edge to edge with cramped handwriting. The entries weren't dated. They didn't need to be. Heard them again tonight. They know my voice now. Snow hides what shouldn't be hidden. Daniel stopped reading when he realized his uncle never wrote the word woods. He always called them they. The phone rang again that afternoon. Still no signal. Still no bars. Daniel stared at the screen until it stopped. A voicemail arrived immediately. Static. Breathing. Then a whisper, stretched thin like it had traveled a long way to reach him. Danny, you left the light on. His stomach dropped. Only his uncle had ever called him that. Daniel unplugged the phone and shoved it into a drawer, but the feeling didn't fade. The cabin felt smaller after that. Lower ceilings. Narrower hallways. He moved carefully, as if sudden motion might draw attention. At dusk, he heard footsteps in the snow. Slow. Measured. They circled the cabin once. Daniel stood in the living room, fire poker clenched in his hands, every muscle locked. He counted the steps without meaning to. The pattern repeated. 12 steps. Pause. Scrape. 12 steps again. Then a voice, close enough to press against the wall. Daniel. He didn't answer. The footsteps retreated. Later, when he worked up the courage to check, the snow was smooth and untouched. No tracks. No sign of anything having been there at all. That was the moment doubt crept in. You're tired. You're isolated. Grief does strange things. Daniel repeated those thoughts like prayers. But doubt didn't erase the details, the way the voice had known where to stand. The way it spoke softly, like it didn't want to scare him. Sleep became impossible. When he did drift off, His dreams were filled with trees bending inward, branches knitting together overhead until the sky vanished. Voices whispered directions he never followed. Always ahead. Always deeper. On the 8th day, Daniel returned to town. Blackridge looked even quieter than before. Snowbanks swallowed doorsteps. Windows were dark despite the early hour. The diner bell rang when he entered, too loud, echoing longer than it should have. The waitress was there again. She didn't ask what he wanted. "You heard them," she said. Daniel swallowed. "I didn't answer." Her eyes flicked to the door. "Good." At a corner table, the old man sat with his untouched coffee. Daniel approached slowly. "My uncle," he said. "He lived out there for years. What happened to him?" The old man stirred his cup, though the liquid didn't move. "He stayed," he said. "That's what happened." Stayed how? Long enough to believe he was still himself. Daniel felt a cold pressure behind his eyes. "They're using his voice." The old man nodded once. "They learn fast." "What are they?" Daniel asked. For a long moment no one spoke. Then the waitress said quietly, "Lost things." The old man added, "Leftover people." Daniel's hand shook. "How do I make it stop?" The waitress's mouth tightened. "You don't." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You leave. Before winter decides you belong." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the diner windows. For a brief second, Daniel thought he saw movement beyond the glass, shapes sliding between buildings where no one stood. He left town without finishing his coffee. Back at the cabin, the light over the porch was on again. He was sure he'd turned it off. Inside, the air felt warmer than it should have. The fire was lit, flames crackling gently. Daniel stared at it, heart pounding. "I didn't do that," he whispered. From the hallway came a sound like fabric dragging across the floor. Then a voice, his own this time, murmured from the darkness. "You came back." The words weren't accusing. They were relieved. Daniel stepped away, every instinct screaming at him to run, but the cabin seemed to hold him in place. The walls felt closer now, the ceiling lower, as if the house were slowly learning how to keep him. From outside, deep in the winter woods, something shifted. Patient, certain. And Daniel understood, with sick clarity, that leaving might no longer be a choice. By the time Daniel understood that the cabin was no longer empty, winter had already sealed the roads. Snow fell for 3 days straight. Not the gentle kind that softened the world, but heavy sheets that erased distance and sound. The forest vanished behind a white curtain, the trees reduced to dark smudges that looked closer than they should have been. The road into Blackridge disappeared entirely, swallowed until it looked like it had never existed. Daniel stopped checking the weather. The radio only played static now, but sometimes, buried beneath it, he heard breathing. Slow, patient, waiting for him to notice. The fire went out on the second night of the storm. Daniel sat in the dark, wrapped in his uncle's coat, listening to the cabin settle. The silence pressed hard against his ears until his own breathing sounded intrusive. He tried not to think about the way the house seemed warmer when the fire was burning, as if something else had enjoyed it too. That's when the footsteps began. Not outside. Inside. They moved down the hallway with careful precision, pausing at each doorway. The sound wasn't heavy. No thud of weight, no creak of boards, but a soft brushing, like someone dragging their hand along the wall to guide themselves in the dark. Daniel didn't move. Didn't breathe. The steps stopped outside his bedroom. A pause. Then a whisper, low and intimate, spoken inches from the door. "You hide the same way he did." Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. "Go away," he said hoarsely. A sound like a smile crept into the voice. "We already found you." The handle turned. The door didn't open. Something on the other side exhaled sharply. Confused, almost irritated. Then the footsteps retreated, fading back into the house until the silence returned, heavier than before. Daniel didn't sleep at all that night. At dawn, or what passed for it beneath the storm, he searched his uncle's notebooks again, hands shaking so badly the pages rattled. The writing grew more frantic toward the end. Words scratched over each other, lines overlapping as if his uncle had been racing something invisible. They don't come from the trees. They come from what the trees keep. If they learn your fear, they learn your shape. Daniel flipped pages faster. It starts with voices, then memories, then they borrow your face. One page was torn nearly in half, the paper ripped hard enough to crease. On it, written larger than the rest, "Do not follow the lost." Daniel leaned back, heart hammering. Lost. That word again. He remembered the waitress. Lost things. Leftover people. The storm eased by afternoon. The woods reappeared slowly, tree by tree, as if being drawn back into existence. Daniel stood on the porch, staring at the forest edge. Snow clung to branches, bending them downward like bowed heads. Something moved between the trunks. Not fast. Not slow. Purposeful. Daniel raised his voice without meaning to. "I see you." The movement stopped. Then, from deeper within the woods, a voice replied. "Then why don't you come closer?" It sounded like a young man. Not his voice. Not his uncle's. Someone else. Daniel stepped back into the cabin and slammed the door. That night, the cabin changed. He noticed it in small ways at first. The hallway felt longer. The distance between rooms subtly wrong. Doors didn't line up the way they had before. He walked into the kitchen twice and swore it was narrower than yesterday. The mirrors were worse. His reflection lagged by a fraction of a second. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough to make his stomach twist. When he raised his hand, the reflection followed. Eventually. He covered the mirrors with sheets. The whispers grew bolder after that. They stopped hiding in the walls. Stopped pretending to be distant. They spoke from corners of rooms, from behind furniture, from places his eyes slid over without ever fully focusing. One night, as he sat on the couch clutching the fire poker, a voice spoke from the empty chair across from him. "You don't remember how it started, do you?" Daniel shook his head. "I didn't do anything." The voice chuckled softly. "Neither did we." Another voice joined it, older, tired. "We were looking for help." A third, closer now. "We were cold." Daniel pressed his palms over his ears. "Stop." They didn't. They talked over each other, voices stacking, overlapping. Men. Women. Children. Familiar tones mixed with strangers. Stories spilled out in fragments. Cars sliding off roads, hunters following the wrong trail, people answering voices that knew their names. The voices weren't angry. They were hurt. And beneath that hurt was something else. Hunger. Daniel screamed and threw the poker at the chair. It passed straight through. The voices stopped instantly. The silence that followed felt disappointed. The next morning, footprints circled the cabin again. This time there were dozens. All barefoot. All stopping at the porch. Daniel drove his truck until the engine screamed and died halfway down the buried road. Snow swallowed the tires. The woods loomed close on either side, branches leaning inward as if curious. From somewhere ahead, a voice called out, "Daniel! Over here!" He froze. The voice sounded like his father. He hadn't heard that voice since childhood. Daniel backed away, heart pounding. "I know you're scared," the voice continued, gentle, coaxing. "But you don't have to be alone out here." The trees shifted. Not with wind. With intent. Daniel ran. He didn't remember how he got back to the cabin. Only the feeling of being watched from all sides. Of paths subtly closing behind him. Of the woods guiding him without ever touching him. Inside the cabin, he collapsed against the door, sobbing. That was when he noticed the photograph on the table. It hadn't been there before. The image showed the cabin decades ago, surrounded by snow. A group of people stood in front of it. Men, women, children. Faces blurred by age and damage. One face wasn't blurred. It was his uncle. Standing among them. Not at the center. Part of them. Daniel dropped the photo. That night, he dreamed of the woods before winter. Green. Alive. People walked between the trees, laughing, calling to one another. The forest closed behind them slowly, gently, like water sealing over a submerged body. He woke to knocking. Not 3 taps. Many. All at once. The entire cabin shook with it. "Let us in." The voices were unified now. "Please." Daniel backed into the corner, shaking his head. No. The knocking stopped. A pause. Then the cabin sighed. The walls creaked outward. The ceiling stretched. The space around Daniel felt suddenly vast, hollow, like the inside of a lung taking a deep breath. A voice spoke from everywhere at once. "If you won't come to us." The floorboards split with a wet crack. "Then we'll stay with you." Hands, too many, too thin, pushed up through the gaps. Pale fingers grasped blindly, feeling the air. Faces followed, rising slowly, features half remembered, unfinished. They weren't climbing. They were emerging. Daniel screamed as the cabin filled with them, with the lost, the cold, the forgotten. And deep beneath their voices, beneath the panic and pleading, the woods whispered approval. Because Daniel finally understood the truth Blackridge never spoke aloud. The winter woods didn't kill people. They kept them. And they never let go. Daniel had stopped thinking in conventional ways. Hours, days. Even the concept of night and day had collapsed into an endless gray haze punctuated by whispers, knocks, and footsteps that circled the cabin relentlessly. The storm had ended weeks ago, yet snow still clung stubbornly to the branches outside. White ghosts standing watch. Even sunlight, when it came through, seemed gray and brittle, unable to pierce the pervasive cold. He crouched in the living room, back against the wall, knees drawn tight, gripping the fire poker like a talisman. The cabin smelled wrong. Something acrid under the scent of pine and old wood. Smoke, though no fire burned. It was a scent he recognized from his uncle's last notebooks, one he had avoided reading until now. "They can enter anything that remembers you," he muttered to himself. "Even the house remembers." The door shuddered. Not like the wind, but with deliberate pressure. Something was outside, pushing, testing. The porch light flickered violently, then died. Darkness pooled at the edges of the windows, thick as ink. Daniel whispered, "Please, just leave me alone." The voice came immediately. Too fast. Too familiar. "We've been waiting." It was his uncle's voice. The tone had warmth, almost caring. But it was wrong. Hollow. Something had learned it. The floorboards creaked behind him. Daniel twisted. A shadow moved in the hallway, stretching impossibly long. He tried to focus, but the figure flickered. Gone, then there, then gone again. He screamed. The sound echoed strangely in the cabin, as if the walls themselves were amplifying it, swallowing and returning it distorted. The shadow didn't respond with fright. It smiled. Or at least Daniel thought it did. The whispers intensified. Multiple voices now, layering, overlapping. They called his name. They sang fragments of lullabies. They recited memories he didn't remember. They claimed him. Daniel ran to the kitchen, desperate for a weapon. But the knives, once neatly on the counter, were gone. Every drawer, every cabinet, emptied or rearranged in a pattern he couldn't decipher. Even the fire poker he had clutched so tightly was missing. "Stop it! Stop it!" he yelled. A single voice, childlike, answered from the ceiling. "We just want you to stay." Daniel's hands went to his head. The whispering voices became louder, angrier, circling him, layering like a chorus of madness. Faces began forming in the walls, pale and incomplete, mouths opening and closing silently. Eyes blinked behind the wallpaper, and his uncle's notebooks fluttered open as if moved by unseen fingers, pages turning rapidly on their own. Daniel tripped over the edge of a rug and fell. His face pressed into the floorboards, and he felt a vibration, subtle like the heartbeat of the cabin itself. A groaning sound rose from beneath, from somewhere deep under the house, low and wet, filling the room with its presence. I don't understand," he gasped. What are you?" The shadow in the hallway expanded, stretching toward him. And suddenly every voice became one, perfectly synchronized. "We are what you fear." We are the ones the snow forgot. The trees remember us. The house remembers us. You belong to us now. The living room flickered with impossible movement. Walls twisted inward. Doors warped into strange angles. Mirrors that he had covered now reflected dozens of him, all screaming silently. The ceiling bent low over his head, pressing, suffocating. Time became meaningless. He blinked, and the room was both empty and full, simultaneously, stretching infinitely in all directions. He could hear his uncle, no, something wearing his uncle's voice, calling from the bedroom. "Come to us, Danny. It's warmer inside." "No." Daniel screamed, crawling toward the hall. He pressed against the far wall, heart hammering. Every instinct told him to run, but the floor beneath him now seemed alive, subtly tilting him toward the shadows. The air grew thick, tasting like iron. Something brushed against his arm. He jerked, expecting hands, claws, but found only empty air. The cabin itself was moving. The floorboard beneath his knees shifted, carrying him forward. The ceiling bent downward as if to crush him, and yet there was room enough for him to stand, to breathe, but just barely. From the darkness in the hallway, a figure emerged. Pale, indistinct, but unmistakably human-shaped. Its face was half his uncle's, half someone else's. One eye blue, one black. It smiled without lips. Daniel stumbled back, barely avoiding its grasp. "We've been waiting," it said, in a chorus of whispers and his uncle's voice layered together. Daniel tripped again, rolling into the corner. The walls closed in slightly, just enough to remind him that there was nowhere to hide. A hand, or something pretending to be a hand, pressed against the wall, slowly tracing his shape. It lingered on his chest, and he felt the imprint of something cold, intangible, forcing a heartbeat he knew wasn't his own. "Why are you doing this?" he yelled. "I didn't hurt anyone." The voice softened, mournful now, as if sensing genuine fear. "No one ever hurts us. We only want company." Another figure appeared from the corner. A small child, snow-drenched, faceless, tugged on his sleeve. Daniel flinched. "No," he screamed, trying to shove it away, but the child's grip was like iron, cold but impossible to remove. "Don't fight us, Danny," the child whispered, in a voice he recognized as his own. Daniel's head pounded. The mirrors erupted suddenly, reflecting hundreds of his own faces, each screaming differently. The reflections began stepping out of the mirrors, one by one, crawling, sliding toward him. Some were screaming silently. Some were laughing. All were moving with the same intent, claiming him, folding him into their mass. He backed up into the kitchen, pressed himself against the wall. A chair lifted itself and slammed into him. He cried out, hitting the floor, his body trembling violently. From the ceiling, shadows dripped like black ink, crawling down onto the walls, spreading over the floor like frozen tar. "Stop it! Stop it!" Daniel screamed over and over, rocking himself forward, pressing his face into the floor. The child, himself, spoke again. "We are you. We always have been. You just didn't remember." Daniel blinked through tears, trying to make sense of it. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, the mirrors. Everything was alive. Everything was him and yet not him. He realized, in the sickening clarity of the moment, that the cabin had never been a refuge. It had been a trap, a container, a collector. He tried to run, to flee toward the hallway, but the floor shifted beneath him. Time warped. Steps he took were mirrored by shadows that weren't his own. Each shadow grasped at his legs, tugging him down. One whispered in his ear, "Why did you come back?" Daniel stumbled, tripped over air, landed hard on the floor. The shadows surged, pressing him into the boards. Faces pressed against his skin through the walls, screaming, whispering, calling his name. "You can't leave," the chorus intoned, synchronized, unstoppable. He closed his eyes, shaking violently. Tried to scream, but no sound came. His voice had been swallowed. And then, from somewhere above, the ceiling cracked with a wet, resonant snap. Dust fell like snow. A figure, tall, impossibly thin, limbs stretching beyond human proportion, leaned through the split. Its face was half-formed, featureless, except for a single blinking eye that was unmistakably his uncle's. "You are ours now," it said, and the walls echoed it 1,000 times over. Daniel thrashed, clawing at the floor, at the walls, at air itself. The mirrors shattered spontaneously, splintering hundreds of faces into jagged shards that hovered in midair for a moment before dissolving into shadow. Then silence. A calm, suffocating silence. Daniel opened his eyes. The cabin was empty. The walls were intact, the floorboards normal. He was lying on the living room rug, chest heaving, tears frozen on his cheeks. The snow outside glistened harmlessly in the weak winter sunlight. No shadows. No whispers. No footprints. He tried to speak, to breathe, to convince himself it had been a dream. But in the corner of the living room, a single notebook lay open. The pages fluttered in the cold breeze from a window he hadn't touched. And written across the page, in letters that weren't his own: "You cannot leave. We have been waiting. We always will." Daniel realized then that the cabin, and the woods, did not need to chase him anymore. They had claimed him, and they would follow, patient, silent, inevitable. He was no longer alone. Not truly. The shadows returned slowly, climbing the walls, dripping from the ceiling in liquid darkness. They did not move aggressively. They did not scream. They simply waited, encroaching, claiming, folding the cabin into something unrecognizable. The whispering returned, soft now, coaxing. "Danny, come to us." He backed against the far wall. His knees gave out. His breathing was shallow. The cold, impossible calm of the woods invaded the room. The temperature dropped until every breath burned. A single word echoed in his mind, repeating like a drumbeat. "Stay." Daniel whispered back almost involuntarily. I can't." The shadows thickened, smothering the firelight. Shapes emerged, faceless, human-like, dragging themselves toward him. One reached out. Its hand brushed his shoulder. Not rough, not cold. Warm. Familiar. Homelike. "We've been lonely," it said. The last remnants of rational thought screamed at him to resist. But the truth pressed heavier than fear. The cabin, the trees, the snow, the lost voices, they had been waiting his whole life. And now he understood. The woods did not kill. The woods remembered. And the woods, along with the shadows, would never ever forget. Daniel's eyes closed. His body sagged. He felt himself fold into the shadows, into the waiting, into the cold embrace of the winter woods. The last thought that passed through his mind, before he disappeared entirely, was not terror. It was a chilling calm. I have come home. Weeks passed. The cabin sat under snow, silent, untouched. The woods behind it seemed ordinary. Still pines, frozen earth, but anyone who looked closely would notice the subtle wrongness. Branches curved toward the house in unnatural arcs, and shadows pooled in corners that sunlight could not reach. The locals of Blackridge still avoided the road leading to it, as they always had, though snow and ice made excuses unnecessary. No one saw Daniel Harper again. No one saw his uncle either. Not truly. Not since the house had become something else. The diner reopened with the first thaw. The old man still sat in the corner every morning, coffee untouched, eyes always scanning the room as though he expected someone, or something, to walk through the door. The waitress cleaned tables and refilled cups, but she no longer spoke of the woods. Those who asked, politely or out of curiosity, were met with silence. She would simply shake her head, mutter, "You don't want to know," and move on. Blackridge carried on. The snow melted. Roads cleared. Visitors came, left, and never returned. The story of Daniel Harper, the outsider who had vanished in the winter woods, drifted into whispers half forgotten, until it became just another local warning, passed cautiously over warm mugs of coffee. But the cabin remained. The door was always slightly ajar, no matter who checked it. Windows reflected a muted, unnatural gray, never quite matching the sky outside. And the moment anyone crossed the threshold, the air seemed to thicken. A subtle pressure pressed against the chest. The house remembered the shape of its last occupant. The floorboards remembered his footsteps. The walls remembered his terror. And the woods waited. Always. Hikers and hunters reported odd things, though rarely in detail. Tracks that appeared only to vanish a few steps later. Voices that called names not their own. A fleeting figure glimpsed through the pines, pale and elongated, moving too deliberately to be a person. Most dismissed these stories, rationalized them, or left the area quietly. A few stayed too long. They never returned. Inside the cabin, the notebooks remained, scattered across the floor as though placed by invisible hands. Pages turned slowly in the breeze that came from nowhere. The handwriting was not consistent. Some passages were frantic, some calm, some written in Daniel's hand, others in voices that he didn't recognize, but all bore the same warning repeated endlessly. Do not follow the lost. They will remember you. You belong to us now. Occasionally, a visitor brave or foolish enough to peek inside would swear they saw a shadow shift in the corner, folding itself into the walls, then dissolving when they blinked. A single whisper might brush past them, almost intimate. Danny, come to us. They didn't see him. They didn't see Daniel. But he was there. Everywhere, nowhere, waiting patiently in the space between memory and silence. He had become what the woods kept, a lost thing, a leftover, a shadow that learned voices and faces, a guardian of the winter forest. Months later, in town, someone would notice a subtle shift. A new voice in the diner, faint, perfectly imitating someone familiar. A stranger would order coffee with an old nickname, slip it naturally into conversation, and the locals would glance away. Nobody asked. Nobody answered. They already knew what it meant. The cabin never left. And the woods, patient, infinite, never stopped remembering. A single sunbeam pierced the living room once, landing on the notebooks. The pages fluttered, settling finally on one sentence, written in bold, sharp letters that seemed to etch themselves deeper into the wood beneath. We have been waiting. We always will. Outside, snow drifted silently against the pines. No footprints marred the fresh layer. No wind moved the branches. And somewhere in the heart of the winter woods, a presence shifted, listening, patient, inevitable. For anyone who dared to pass too close, the faintest sound might reach them. A knock at the door. A name called softly on the wind. The echo of a voice they thought they knew. Come to us. And in that moment, even the bravest soul understood, deep in the marrow of their bones, that some places are never abandoned. That some woods do not forget. That some horrors are not only inevitable, they are eternal. Daniel Harper had disappeared, but he remained. In the cabin, in the woods, in every whisper, every shadow, every fleeting glimpse of something moving just beyond the corner of vision. He had become part of the waiting, part of the snow, part of the memory of the forest itself. Blackridge told its stories quietly, carefully. The tourists never understood. The hikers who ignored the warnings vanished. But the locals knew. And they did not speak. Because some things, once they are claimed, are never meant to be returned. The cabin waits. The woods wait. And somewhere within the silence, Daniel Harper waits too, forever. The last snow of winter falls, soft, thick, and undisturbed. A single branch taps against a window. A whisper drifts from the edge of the pines. We've been lonely. No one answers. No one dares. And the winter woods remember.